the whole kind of woo-woo about non-locality or goes away.
Diane Hennacy Powell, MD, is a neuropsychiatrist and internationally recognized expert on autism and Savant syndrome.
I applied to medical school with the intention of becoming a neurosurgeon. And so I was accepted at Johns Hopkins on a full scholarship, and I went on to being on faculty at Harvard.
Her research, which focuses on autistic children who have ESP as a savant skill, has been presented at international scientific conferences and is featured in the popular podcast, The Telepathy Tapes.
Well, I actually had hypothesized that autistic savants would be the most likely to demonstrate psychic abilities to the extent that mainstream science is really demanding, and so then I thought, well, that's telling me that physics doesn't say this is impossible. It's what's difficult to make sense of is how is it that the brain participates in this.
And so now for my conversation with Dr. If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. So now here is Dr. Powell, who I am so excited to speak with. Welcome, Dr. Powell.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you.
It's a pleasure to see you as well. Now, just tell us about a little bit about your education and training, because I think that just gives so much credibility to this type of work, just in a transformative way.
Well, I was raised in a scientific family with a father who was a scientist who had graduate degrees in 3 different disciplines of science. And so I grew up with science kits. And when I was an undergraduate, I became attracted to neuroscience before it was even a major. And so I carved out my own curriculum, taking courses in physiological psychology and biophysics and zoology and animal behavior. And what I discovered was that I really was most interested in human consciousness. And I was also someone who didn't want to do research on animals. And so I applied to medical school with the intention of becoming a neurosurgeon, because at that time, neurosurgeons were the ones doing the most exciting research. Consciousness wasn't even something that you could study back then, but you had neurosurgeons that were mapping the brain by basically having the patient awake when they were doing the surgery to remove, say, a tumor or an aneurysm, and stimulating different sections of the brain around the tumor to see what happened as a result. And oftentimes people would have full-blown memories come up just from the stimulation of a particular area. And I thought, that's fascinating. In order to really try to answer some of these questions that are most interesting, like, about memory, where is memory stored? I thought that I would I would be able to, do that research and also help people by going to medical school. And so I was accepted at Johns Hopkins on a full scholarship and did a lot of surgery as well as neurology. And then what I discovered when I was doing my rotations was that I really liked the experience I had in the psychiatry department, because the psychiatrist who was the chairman was also a neurologist. And so he was really teaching us psychiatry from a perspective in which we took into account the medical conditions that would not only cause psychiatric syndromes, but also various syndromes that are in neurology and really kind of obscure, but the kind of syndromes that people like Oliver Sacks wrote about. And syndromes, for example, that would be caused by a stroke in a particular part of the brain, and it would selectively remove your memory for certain things. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I don't need to be a neurosurgeon and doing what they do. I could actually be spending a lot of my time talking with people who have these various states of being that really all are different from the neurotypical person, and yet at the same time, neuroimaging was coming up, and I thought, well, that's another way in which I could explore the brain. And so I trained in neuropsychiatry, and I met Oliver Sacks in 1986 after his book came out, and he was on a book tour, and he came to Johns Hopkins. And in reading his book, I found that the syndrome that I was the most interested in was Savant syndrome, in which you have these individuals, like these twins that he studied, who could generate prime numbers in 6 digits without deriving it or calculating it. In fact, there really isn't a good algorithm for calculating primes, and they just would see the numbers. And Oliver Sacks was able to test them successfully up to 12 digits, and they were accurate. And then they even went on to do 20 digits, but at the time in the 60s, computers couldn't even generate 20-digit primes. And so here you had these twins who were institutionalized, who couldn't do basic self-care kinds of tasks, and who really couldn't even do basic arithmetic. And yet here they were able to do that. They were able to do calendar calculations where they could tell you what day of the week any date would be, for thousands of years. And so I thought, wow, this is what I'd really love to study. And so I went to England and I studied with Sir Michael Rudder, who was knighted later for his work on autism. And he was at the Institute of Psychiatry and the Maudsley Hospital. And so I studied with him for 6 months in child psychiatry and came back wanting to study autism more. But it was so rare back then that I focused more on adult neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's. So that's my educational background. And I went on to being on faculty at Harvard.
I'm going to assume, based on your education, original career, you assumed consciousness was created by a brain, materialist model for a while, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you don't go into neuroscience if you don't have that model as your. It's and you don't even question it. I mean, when you're only 18, 19 years old, you revere your professors, and you just think, okay, that what they're doing, they know more than me. And so there were also all of these conditions that I studied that showed that if you had damage to a particular part of the brain, you would get a psychological or behavioral syndrome. And so I thought, surely the consciousness is, located in the brain. And, yet, I mean, the big question has always been, how could, what is consciousness and how can consciousness be created by the brain? But it's just, you just don't question that assumption. And to this day. And yet I started to, the more I dug deeper into some of these syndromes, and then also met a patient at Harvard who was able to tell me information about myself that she had no way of knowing, and after that, and predicted things in the future that happened, and very precise things, like, exactly where I'd be. She predicted that I was going to move within the next year to San Diego, and that's what we did. And this is within the first 10 minutes of meeting her. So I that really rocked my world, and that was over 30 years ago. And it made me realize that we have an incomplete model in neuroscience, and it excludes a lot of things as impossible because this incomplete model can't explain them, and yet it can't explain very much anyway. And so why exclude all of these experiences, such as the one that I just had, where you can't explain it if you think of consciousness as being something that is purely material in nature.
And how did you initially make sense of that? As I know, I also thought there was no such thing as an afterlife or anything like that. And my very first experience did not change my mind. It was bit by bit. So how did you begin to change your mind?
Well, it's been a process. So initially I thought, well, I was already aware of 20th century, early 20th century physics. I was already aware of, for example, the quantum theory and this idea that our sense of reality is really created by our senses, and yet reality is far stranger than we would ever think that it would be. And so, for example, and I talk about these things in my book, The ESP Enigma. You have uh, these experiments in which it shows that if you're measuring something, like this is called the double slit experiment, if you're measuring something, then the wave-like the wave-like nature of an electron or a photon changes, and with the act of measurement, it actually gets defined and becomes more like a particle. And this was something that I thought, well, that's very interesting, and to think in terms of matter as having a wave-like property. So that's one thing. And then I also was aware of entanglement and the fact that if two particles are entangled, two electrons are entangled, then if you alter one, the other one is altered instantaneously. And I knew that some of the ways in which physicists were trying to explain these things was by looking at basically the fact that our sense of dimensions is also altered by our sensory system, that kind of locks us into this experience of three-dimensional space, and then time is something that moves in an arrow. It can only move forward, it can't move backwards. And Einstein really showed us that with his thought experiments and then the mathematics behind all of that, that our sense of time is an illusion, that actually that the past, present, and future seem to all coexist. So then I thought, well, that's telling me that physics doesn't say this is impossible for somebody to predict the future. It's what's difficult to make sense of is how is it that the brain participates in this. So then, I started looking into the research that parapsychologists have conducted. I mean, there's over 100 years of studies that have been well documented with controlled conditions. A lot of these phenomena, like telepathy and psychokinesis and precognition. And I thought, well, there really is a lot of solid research on this. And some of it was even funded by the military for decades. And so they wouldn't have been funding it if there wasn't some there. And in 1995, some of that research that was being done at the Stanford Research Institute using remote viewing, where that's another example of kind of this consciousness accessing information non-locally, it's where they're seeing something. A lot of them were just given the geophysical, navigation points, and they were asked, well, what's at this particular coordinate? And then they would draw something that turned out to be absolutely what was located there. And some of this was even secret to the U.S. government because it was being done. This was a way of spying, for example, on the Russians. And so I thought, okay, so there's this evidence there. And I thought, well, what is the common mechanism by which all of these different people say that they access this information? What's going on there? And I realized from some of the accounts that people like Ingo Swann said that they did something called astral projection. And when I looked into astral projection, I saw that, that's an out-of-body experience. And I've had patients, because of my work as a psychiatrist, with people who've been extremely traumatized at a very, very young age. I've had patients who've been in my office telling me that they're watching the conversation from the ceiling because and that they would leave their body because they couldn't handle the emotional pain. So I always then wondered, well, how is it that consciousness can have a perspective that's not an embodied perspective? And in psychiatry, we hear those kind of accounts and we just call them dissociative states. And there's that never been like within the field, there's never been a question of, well, maybe that tells us that our model for how the brain and consciousness relate to one another is incorrect. And then I realized that not only did the people who've had severe trauma have these out-of-body experiences and oftentimes be able to do a read on me too. And so, where they would tell me something that I'm just like, wait a minute, how do you know that? And then also looking at people who've had near-death experiences, which frequently, if not always, has an out-of-body component to it, and seeing that they also report an increase in these psychic experiences. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, because what it suggests is if consciousness can somehow exist outside of the confines of our body, that then you have access to information that exists elsewhere. That the problem is maybe this idea that consciousness is perhaps trapped in the body. This whole dualism that Descartes talked about, where it's like this idea of is there a soul, and is it that the soul enters into the body, but that under certain circumstances that soul can temporarily leave. And and there are lots of cultures around the world, indigenous cultures, who believe that we astral project during our dreaming sleep. And dreaming sleep is yet another time when people who don't normally have these psychic experiences can have them. And then similarly, with that knowledge that out-of-body experiences seem to be common to these abilities, I found out that the autistic savants that I work with also spend a lot of time in an out-of-body experience, and that may even be why they have such difficulty using their body to type and to articulate words and that sort of thing. So anyway, it really, that's kind of the trajectory. It's really that a series of thought experiments based on what I knew of physics and what I knew as a sort of in the field scientist and clinician studying consciousness.
Yeah, it's all fascinating. And I know now you've been focusing a lot on savants, and I'm sure many of our listeners know the Telepathy Tapes. And if you don't, please check it out. So, what was your first realization that savants, it's not just a, physiological reaction, but that something might be going on that's psi related?
Oh, well, I actually had hypothesized that autistic savants would be the most likely to demonstrate psychic abilities to the extent that mainstream science is really demanding, because they really want someone that is reliable and extremely accurate. So, there's lots of research out there that shows that if you do a study with, let's say, Zener cards, and by chance, since there's 5 Zener cards, by chance, there's 1 in 5 chance that you're going to get it correct if you're just guessing. And so if you do just a series of trials, hundreds of trials with Zener cards, what you'll find is that oftentimes there's, like a 25% above chance hit rate, which is statistically significant, especially the more trials you do, the more significant it becomes. But unfortunately, statistics that are these large, sort of meta studies don't seem to move the needle much in terms of shifting the paradigm, especially when you're asking them to shift it as much as going from believing that the brain creates consciousness to believing that the brain just navigates consciousness.
And I know you touched upon some of the research, and I'll definitely want to get more into your work with Savant, but since you brought that up, I want to go ask you about that. I mean, the research is remarkable. And again, like I first learned of a lot of it reading your book, and I was just like, there's no way. And then I delved further and it backed up. But it is absolutely paradigm shifting in a very factual, tangible way. Why do you think the scientific community, even if they don't draw the conclusion that consciousness is non-local, why do you think they completely dismiss it?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I chose to work with savants is that what savants do is just as mysterious as anything that parapsychologists study, and yet they do it reliably, and neuroscientists don't question it. It may not be real common, but they don't question it at all. And I thought, well, that's an inroad. And then when I saw that Bernie Rimland, who had an autistic son and studied thousands of autistic individuals, that he actually, if you go through his notes, you'll see that he thought that ESP was a savant skill. He saw it, he said, in around 3% of his savants, but he was not testing for it. It was just what he observed. And so it's probably just the tip of the iceberg there. And so why is it that other scientists can't make that leap that I did, which is, well, these kids are also in the same, they have the same condition that leads to savant syndrome, which we don't already understand, and which is, and some of those skills are so similar to ESP that, I think they should be considered, ESP should be considered a savant skill. Why can't they make that leap? And I think that a lot of it has to do with, first of all, the lack of personal experience of it. They're not interacting with patients like I do. I mean, I was a materialist, but then when you have somebody that I wasn't going out and seeking psychic readings, I mean, and when you have somebody tell you, oh, your husband's a chemist, and he's applying for a job in 2 cities right now, the very week that he's applying for postdocs in 2 different cities. I mean, that grabs your attention. And so it's hard, though, to know then where to put that. And so one of the reasons I wrote the ESP Enigma was that I thought people need to have a scientific framework, because what happens is that you've got all of that foundational training that's in the materialist model. And then now you're being asked to just kind of throw a lot of that away. And that's really hard for people to do. I mean, you have a lot of people that have built their whole career and their reputation on theories that are, just the brick and mortar of the model that you're asking them to overthrow, so that's part of it. But even with the young people, they've been taught this by people that they respected, and it creates a cognitive dissonance. They can't. It's really, they need a pathway to connect what they learned, because you don't throw out neuroscience. I mean, there's a lot of, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's just that it's an incomplete model. Just like physics, we don't throw out Newtonian physics. When we had Bohr and Einstein and other physicists come forward and say, well, there's this whole other reality if you go down to the Planck scale. But what it is that you just realize that certain things are good for certain things within science, and theories are good for predicting certain things, but other theories fail miserably at predicting. And the whole point of having a theory is so that you can generate hypotheses and then do experiments to prove or disprove it. And if you have a theory that just says, well, you're dead in the water if you even ask that question, then science is never going to get very far.
Right. And so, if I'm correct, Haley was the first savant that you worked with. Is that correct?
But she's the first savant that I did the telepathy testing with. But I was invited to go over to India after writing my book and making this prediction about autistic savants. I was invited to go over there by a woman who worked for the Indian government, and she worked with autistic children. And she read my book, and she wrote to me and she said, "You're absolutely right. The work you're doing is really critical, and I want to invite you to India to give a workshop on ESP. And also, I have some savants that you could evaluate over here." And I thought, "Oh, great!" And so I went to Chennai and met several savants there. I mean, they had skills. Like one of them had a skill where she could take a 1,000-piece puzzle in which all of the pieces were silver. Okay, so there's no pattern or color cues, and she was able to assemble it in like a week. Now, I wouldn't even be able to assemble something like that, I don't think.
I don't think I would either.
And then another person named Vishal, who was this little boy who was only 5 years old, and his mother said he knows things in science that I don't know. And and he had learned how to type with some facilitation on a keyboard, and she invited me, to do some tests with him. And I was asking him questions that, I mean, your typical 5-year-old is not going to know the answer to, particularly since I'm asking them in English. And although a lot of people in India speak English, I mean, it's not, they also speak their own, dialect. And so, I'd ask him things like, what is Huntington's disease? And then he'd type that it was, a cognitive disorder, which is true. It's a dementia. Now, how many 5-year-olds type in, cognitive disorder and would know what Huntington's disease is? And there's no way that his mother was like prepping for this and that she was doing the answers. And it certainly wasn't her background at all in medicine and so I tested him on various things, and it wasn't that he got everything 100% correct, but he sure got a lot correct. I mean, I tested him in math and whatnot. And so what happened, though, was that just as I was getting ready to leave India, one of the parents says to me, "Oh, by the way, she's also telepathic." And I said, "She's telepathic?" "Oh, yeah. I can't lie to her about anything. If I tell her we don't have any more potato chips left, and we do, she'll call me on it. She'll call me on it and take me over to the cabinet where they are." And so I can't hide what I'm giving her for, a gift, she already knows what it is. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And I thought that's a confounding variable though, because how do I know that this 5-year-old who's giving me a math, the answer to a mathematical question, how do I know that he's not just getting the answer from me? And if they're telepathic, I mean, so I thought I need to really test for telepathy. And shortly after I got back to the US, there was actually an article about, and once again, I found out about the article because someone sent it to me because they were aware of my research. And it was an article about a girl in India who named Nananda, who was 100% accurate in terms of reading her mother's mind. And it got the attention of me, and it also got the attention of Daryl Treffert. And so then, within, I don't know how many months after that, was when both Daryl Treffert, who's the expert on Savant syndrome, who passed away several years ago. He was the consultant to Rain Man. And he studied a lot of the most famous savants that are there. And so anyway, so he was notified about Haley by the father, and so was I. And so we both went to Haley's home to test her for telepathy. And it was just remarkable I mean, at the time we both were made aware of her, she was typing independently. And so nobody was touching her, and no, and she wasn't using a letterboard. She was typing into this iPad that had an electronic voice, and so you would see the therapist with her calculator like this, going, Haley, what's the cube root of this number? And it'd be like a 6-digit number, and there's no way Haley can see the calculator. And then Haley'd go, dit, 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 and sure enough, it's like, it's the right mathematical answer. And the family thought at first she was a savant. But then one day when the calculator that the therapist was using died, and she picked up her iPad to use as a calculator, it gave the answer in logarithmic notation. And then Haley, who's not able to see it, and before the therapist was able to correct it, to get into just normal notation, Haley types out the logarithmic notation.
Wow, that's so. Do you think, was she remote viewing or reading the therapist's mind? And see, what is your assessment of that?
Well, what happened next was that the therapist said, wait a minute, Haley, how'd you do that? And Haley said, I see the numerators and denominators in your head. And she goes, what? Are you reading my mind? And Haley said, yes. And so then she started asking Haley questions to things that there was no way Haley should know. And Haley knew the answers. And at that point, she was blown away and didn't know what to do. And it actually took her several weeks before she told the parents, because she was afraid of what they might think. But then eventually she told them. They went and checked it out for themselves. They're like, oh my gosh, the father is actually a medical doctor. And so he was like blown away, because being a medical doctor, he knew, the same paradigm I was trained in, which is, these things are impossible. And so then what happened is that meanwhile, another therapist started working in the home with Haley, and she noticed that Haley was making the same spelling mistakes that she would make. You know how oftentimes we have those words that we always misspell, and it's our idiosyncrasy. Well, that's what Haley was doing. And so what happened is that she said to Haley, it's like, you're making the same mistakes as me. It's like you're reading my mind, and half jokingly. And Haley goes, yeah, I am reading your mind. And then she said to Haley, she says, well, how do you say I love you in German? Because this woman was bilingual. And then Haley, never been exposed to German, types I love you in German.
Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title.
So then this therapist is like, oh my gosh, how do I tell anybody? And she was very, very relieved when she told the parents, and the parents said, yeah, we know, and we're still trying to make sense of it ourselves. And so that provided the opportunity for me to actually go and do controlled trials with Haley using 2 different therapists.
Would you tell us a little about the controls, the protocols, and the experiments that you were able to do?
Sure. So, well, one of the problems was that I knew from having, a relationship with people at the scientists at IONS. I mean, I'd written some articles for their journal, and I was a full member of the Parapsychological Association. After my book came out, they made me a full member, and so I knew the protocols that parapsychologists demand, and they really don't like it if you're saying we're going to be doing telepathy and they're in the same room. They think, oh, how do we know that there's not some kind of cueing going on? And and even though there's no reason to, I mean, these are the last people who are going to be trying to scam me. I mean, and they didn't even want their names to be used, but they were willing to let me film them and then digitize the face of the people involved and present it at scientific conferences, because they realized, I mean, you're going to need visual proof. I mean, you can't just go say, "Oh, this kid does this," and just believe me. I mean, people want to see it. So I, was planning on filming it myself, even though I had these homemade videos of the phenomenon that the father had sent to me. And then, what happened was is that I thought, well, we need to have some visual barrier here. We need to erect something. I knew that it'd be unlikely to be able to get them in separate rooms, but I thought we can create a visual barrier here. And what happened was is when the barrier went up, she regressed, because one of the things about autistic children is that they don't handle change very much. They really they can have a meltdown over things that we might think of as being, something that you should easily soothe them out of, and just say, oh, don't be anxious about this. Don't be anxious about this change to your environment. You can't do that. I was talking with one of the therapists who's doing research with the children just yesterday, and she was telling me that he has this keyboard that he uses for typing independently for the experiments, and she touched it, and then because she had touched it, he was like, "Well, I can't use that keyboard now." And and it's like, "But why can't you use that keyboard now?" Well, that's the keyboard that I use for such and such, and now, it's been touched by you. And it's like, so it's like, and it's like they can have this very rigid thinking about how things need to be. And so if you're going to be coming in there and you've got cameras and you're miking them and you're, all that attention, when it's just been the subject and their therapist, just working on their own privately. I mean, it's just very disruptive. And so putting in that barrier, what happened was is that Haley stopped typing independently, and she would still do the experiments, but she would do the experiments using a letterboard. And so what happened was is that I was able to get them to put a barrier so that they're sitting side by side, but there's a barrier between the two, and the therapist would basically reach around the barrier and hold the stencil or letterboard for
And the
Haley.
barrier assures that Haley's not getting information with her eyes.
Yeah,
Correct.
so at least, she was not getting information from the therapist's eyes. I really wanted to be able to put the stencil on a stand so that she could type onto the stencil, and I didn't even have to have the therapist holding it. But that's problematic as well, because that's just yet another change. But the other thing is that oftentimes these children tend to get fixated, and they need to have someone, kind of prod them to go on to the next one, because left to their own, they're waiting for some signal, but because of the way that they're trained to type, they're waiting for some signal when they're using the letterboard to like go on to the next one. I got it, that's the letter you want, or that's the number you want. move on. And so the way that the therapists typically signal that then is just lift the board up, kind of like almost like with a movie, it's like, start here. Yeah. And so that's what they're doing. And really because she can't see what's going on over there, she can't be really directing it. So it's not only that Haley can't see her eyes, she can't see what Haley's doing, so that she could be moving the board like this way or that to get Haley to point at one particular thing or another. And we had cameras set up. We had cameras in the front of the room, on the sides of the room, and then the back of the room, so that we could capture from all angles what was going on. And and it's really intensive video footage, because I was able to do 6 hours worth of controlled trials using randomized words and images and numbers. And Haley was just like this little trooper, just like dee 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 dee, And then when the therapist said, and the talker, she'd then type it into the talker. She'd do it like this, and you could see her do that. And then she'd type it into the talker, and you could hear it. Okay, and then the therapist would go, "Good, Haley, now for the next one." And then, and then it'd be the next one. And she did that for 4 hours with one therapist in divided sessions, and she did it for 2 hours with another therapist. Her accuracy was like around 97%.
It's amazing. Wow. And with algorithms, mathematical algorithms, are all different words or different things, or
everything. I mean, everything. I'm saying on average, I'd say on that she and the mistakes that she made were generally ones where it really was more of a she'd hit somebody, and then she realized right away that it was incorrect, and then she'd actually self-correct. But I still counted that as an error. And she had one string of, I think it was like 165 numbers that she just did. You're just like, how do you make sense of that? And I mean, the chances of this being that this is a fraudulent thing, they're just really so low. And yet, unfortunately, because of the fact that a stencil board is involved and they're not in separate rooms, that study is still, criticized by some people. But most people haven't seen the actual footage. I mean, if they were to actually look at all of the camera footage from all angles and really analyze it, that'd be a different story. But instead, what they do is they'll take the 5-minute clip or whatever that's on the internet from a talk that I gave, and think that's all they have. That's their only. That's not the whole proof. Okay, that's just a little segment from one angle, one camera angle. Okay, and you really can't criticize it if you haven't looked at all of the experimental data. And I'm looking forward to revisiting her. I mean, here 10 years later, I'm looking forward to revisiting her. She's now 21. She was 11 when I did that research, and the therapists have since moved on. But what's happened is the mother is no longer afraid to be telepathic with her. She at first, when she found out her daughter was telepathic, she was like, "Oh my God, what do I do? I don't like this."
Right.
No privacy here.
Yeah. I could definitely understand a parent or anyone feeling that.
Yeah. But now she just treats it as, well, this is how Haley, communicates. This is how she. And so they actually, and I think this to their credit, is they don't make a big deal out of it. I mean, they've sort of kind of normalized it within the household, just like, well, this is just kind of what Haley does.
And could Haley read anyone's mind? Like, if I was seated next to her at a restaurant and never met her, would she know my thoughts, or is this exclusive to people who have a relationship of sorts with her? And other savants, I assume, with the same abilities.
Yeah, I would say that, I'd say for the majority of them, they they have to have a relationship with somebody. I mean, it's described by the individuals involved in this as shared consciousness, and Manisha, who's in the documentary, she's the next, she's the third child that I studied intensively. And she likes the idea of calling this shared consciousness instead. And if you think about what shared consciousness implies, it implies that you're allowing your consciousness to overlap with another individual's consciousness. And that individual has to feel safe to do that. I mean, that's like, it's like intimacy on steroids, particularly for a kid who is as sensitive as these children are, and get thrown off by any kind of inconsistencies. Yeah, so I think that that's true. I also think, though, that telepathy is enhanced when there's a heart-to-heart connection. It's not just with these children. I mean, there's a lot of research on that. The Heart Math Institute talks about it. A lot of people will talk about the role of love and these kinds of abilities, that there's, it's like when you're in love or you're feeling love, it's like you're vibrating at a certain frequency that seems to be conducive to being in resonance with another individual, such that you actually can anticipate what it is that they're feeling or thinking. So I'd say that's true for the majority of them. However, I also hear from some of the families that their child just basically can't go out in public very much at all because they're reading everybody's thoughts. And so some of them seem to not have any filter at all. So I think it's variable, but it can be really hard to then have as a study subject somebody who reads everybody's thoughts, because then it's like having extra noise in the signal. I mean, it's like somebody could, if that makes sense to you. I mean, it's like
It does
it's
completely,
like
yeah.
being in a room where everybody's talking, and you're somehow supposed to be picking up the signal from the person that's over there in the corner.
Right. And I know there's been quite a bit of research into psychic mediums' brains when they go into, either giving psychic readings or medium readings. Do you know to what extent autistic savant brains parallel that, if they do, or anything interesting about brain patterns?
You're talking about with mediums, you mean, or did they share anything in common
Do
with?
they share anything in common? And if not, is there still anything interesting regarding autistic
Um,
savants'
well,
brains?
we don't have a whole lot of literature about the EEGs on mediums. I mean, it's Jeff Tarrant is somebody who, wrote a book about it, and he's studied several mediums, and he didn't find a consistent pattern really between mediums, which is interesting. And what I mean by that is, let's say, Susie and Mary and John are all mediums. Okay. Well, it might be that Susie mediumship skills in the occipital lobe, like Laura Lynn Jackson. Okay. But John's mediumship, may involve, the right, temporal parietal juncture, and so what I suspect is that that it really can be individual, how they receive the information, that their preferred ways. I mean, and that makes sense, because if you think about it, there are some people that say, "Oh, I see this. Okay, this is what he's showing me." It's a very visual description of what information they're getting. Whereas you'll have other people that'll say, I hear, him talking to me, and this is what he's saying. And so that for them, it's an auditory experience. And then there are other people that it feels more like they're channeling the information. They're just like, well, I'm just saying this. And, it's not that they hear it. It's not that they see it. They're just speaking it or automatic writing it, and so it makes sense, given what I know about the brain. It makes sense that different individuals would have a different way in which they access information. And I think what we need is larger scale studies to see, well, does everybody who says they see the information, do they all see it, with changes, showing up in their visual cortex, for example. And one of the things that's interesting about Laura Lynn is that she says that she gets psychic information in one visual field, and then she gets mediumship information in the other visual field, and you have this crossover in the visual cortex, such that that field goes over here and that field goes over here, and so she had the corresponding changes in the half of the visual cortex that would correspond to the visual field where she said she saw the information, which that is to me very profound findings that really suggest that they're not just, she's not just making this stuff up. I mean, she's actually perceiving it. And I think of, that the Indians as in India are correct in that they consider the mind itself to be another sense.
So fascinating. Yeah. And it would be really interesting to scan different autistic savants' brains too, I assume, and see how the variations there. And what is the hill?
Oh, well, the hill is, so the hill came up for the first time, actually, when we went to Atlanta, Georgia to meet and study John Paul in Houston. And it was when we were there that we found out that, John Paul and Houston were, they're both nonverbal or non-speaking autistic. And John Paul was 17 and Houston, I think, was 21 at the time. And they developed this friendship where, they didn't have to speak with, they don't have to speak with one another, but they seem to know, kind of what's going on with the other. And then one day, one of the parents said that, she found out that, she asked John Paul, what he was doing. And he's like, well, he'd go into his room and he'd, put the pillows over his head and, and he's like, well, John Paul, what are you doing when you go in there? Oh, I'm, talking to my friends on the hill. And he's like, oh, you've got friends? Oh yeah. This is where we, the other, people like me, the other.
Do you mind if I just also clarify one thing? When he's speaking with his mother, he's nonverbal and he's using a board, correct?
He's using, so he's using a letterboard and he's spelling out that he goes to the hill, okay? And that the hill is a place where they can all gather and they can share, stories with one another. They can teach one another things. It's kind of like, it's sort of like the Akashic records. There's like a library there, but it's a gathering place, and the people that I guess attend it most regularly are other non-speaking autistics, although, occasionally someone else can pop in, I guess. But so anyway, and so what happened was, though, that, after hearing them describe that, my initial thought was, well, this was more just like what John Paul and Houston had going on, and that, just like you have twins that can have, telepathy between the two of them, and they can even form their own language. And so I was kind of seeing it that way. But then what happened is that someone else independently, that Kai, after we started, what's interesting is that after we started working on the telepathy tapes, but before anything about the hill came up, she was contacted by somebody saying, oh, mentioning the hill, that, this kid goes to the hill. And so then we found it out from someone else. And so it's important that that those stories came out before it was put in the, anywhere online or, in the, in this podcast or anything, because now at this point, if a child says, oh, I'm on the hill, I'm not going to know what to make of it. So I think that those accounts of children that were reported going to this place before we ever, mention on the podcast is really important. But I must say, though, that there are other autistic individuals who are actually speaking autistic individuals who've told me about a place that sounds very much like the Hill. They just didn't call it the Hill.
Did they ever go there and have an experience or get a piece of information that they all ended up sharing, that they then, on the board told their parents or caregivers, and all of them had the same experience?
Not that I'm aware of, but what I'm doing right now is I'm designing experiments to test the telepathy among them, because that's what we'd like to do. Is we'd like to say, okay, you guys all go to the Hill, okay, and I want you to decide upon a number or something. Decide upon a number that you're all going to agree that then you're going to come back and have your facilitator work with you to communicate, and then just have all of them independently send me the numbers, and I'll see, what comes in, that kind of an experiment. Because it should be easy enough to test, and I've already started putting, having the therapist put some of the children that are, that she's witnessed some telepathy happening between them, put them in separate rooms and play a game of, can you do telepathy from separate rooms? And I have some preliminary data that just suggests that this one pair of boys, might be able to demonstrate that. So that's kind of how I'm approaching it as a scientist.
The Hill just blew me away when I learned about it. It's just amazing. And, so experientially, then it seems that the savants tend to get information differently, correct? Like I know Haley said she's reading her therapist or mother's mind. And are there others? Do you have any idea sensorially how it works for them? Are they hearing people's thoughts, going out of their body and seeing? Are they able to communicate?
Well, I know that they have out-of-body experiences, and I think that they actually spend a lot of time in a partial out-of-body experience. Because we're not wired this way, we never have these kinds of experiences. It can be hard to even imagine. But I remember having a patient once who was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and he was able to see things from his in-body perspective and from up above simultaneously. So he could literally be like walking down the street, seeing the street view, but at the same time seeing it from up above. And I thought, well, when I first heard that, I thought, wow, that's really wild. But the reason why I, accepted that as, well, that may be really, what he can experience is because you have other examples of a divided consciousness. So that one of the perfect examples of that is Kim Peek, who is the savant that Rain Man's modeled after. And Kim Peek could read two books simultaneously, one with each eye.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, and so that suggests to me that it's like he had two different, it's almost like having like two television screens, inside your mind's eye, that each can be, just performing their own, doing their own thing, and getting encoded into memory. Because Kim Pink is also the person who could recite word for word over 12,000 books, forwards and backwards. And so, so I think that I'm very interested in understanding, what is it that these savants actually experience. And so I've been doing all of this research on my own dime for the most part. I mean, I've had some, travel expenses and things like that was paid by Deepak Chopra for when I went to do research with Akil one time. But I otherwise haven't had the time to really spend asking those kinds of questions. Because it's not as simple as just asking the question the way I could ask you that question. I mean, it's you have to, you're asking them to answer things that are, fairly nuanced, and I don't want to be giving them suggestions of what to say. So it's something that I want to do. It needs to be done carefully, and I want to coordinate that data that I get from that with the data that I get from doing EEGs, so I can see. Oh, compare, for example, if they say I'm having out of body experiences, and that's how I get the data, then compare that with other research that's been done on people who have out of body experiences, for example, and see, if it's parallel. And then similarly, another child who says, "Oh, I see the information," it'd be very interesting to look at the visual cortex and compare that with other people who say that they see things. So I think that it's really exciting to be in this in this time period now where we have the opportunity really to explore some of these questions that I've been interested in for a long time, but now hopefully we'll have the resources to do so.
Right, because from what I understand, you're retiring and now able to pursue these experiments, like the ones you just mentioned, hopefully full time, right?
Yes, that's right.
Oh, exciting. We'll have to all follow. Hopefully we'll get a lot of insight. And now going back in the beginning, I know you talked some about physics. And do you have a theory based on physics, probably more like a hypothesis of how this all could work? All these non-local, non-physical consciousness.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's first of all. I mean, I encourage people, if they haven't read my book, or they want kind of a layman's explanation of physics, to order a copy of my book, because it really helps you to understand a foundation for what I would say, because I don't know how many people have that kind of background. But so, I mean, based upon what we know from Einstein, for example, I do believe in the block universe theory, that the past, present, and future all coexist, and that what you have here is when we're in the embodied perspective. Okay, it's a lot like being in the Matrix. Okay, because you're locked into a three-dimensional physical space and a single directional time. And yet that's not actually how the universe is constructed. The universe is constructed holographically and as a block universe, and it's got many more dimensions than the ones that we experience. And so I think that the whole kind of woo-woo about non-locality or goes away when you start looking at the fact that you have things like entanglement, and I think entanglement shows that those two particles are really, even though they seem separated in this 3.5 dimensional space, that they're not separated if you just add more dimensions, because we know that when you add more dimensions you actually have more connectivity. So I think that this illusion of separateness is really because we don't really understand, we don't perceive dimensions usually, but once you get it's something changes in some individuals such that they're no longer locked into that 3.5 dimensional space. And so I think this is one of the reasons why people talk about fourth and fifth dimensional beings, is that they're really describing this ability to somehow perceive things, that it's like there's an unlocking of this ability, which is sort of like, to use the sci-fi, it's like breaking out of the Matrix into a greater reality that's there. It's this, we're just getting in our way of getting there.
What are your thoughts on survival of conscious afterlife? Because all of this could work, super psi or psychic abilities, mind reading, energy reading, whatever. And that doesn't necessarily mean survival. Do you think we survive? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I think that we survive really comes from the reincarnation research that was done by Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, where he looked at these children who were, they were very young still. I mean, a lot of them were like 5 years old, but they like spontaneously start talking to their families about another family that's their family too. And he would go take the names and the cities that the children said that they lived in before, and he would actually go there and he'd find that, oh, there is a family here with that name, and oh, they did lose a son with the name that this boy said that he had, and that the boy would be taken there, and he knew who everybody was and knew all kinds of things about it. And so, and he did like, he studied, hundreds of cases, but but the book, 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation. When I read that book, gosh, decades ago, I thought, wow, okay, that is really very compelling evidence. And then, you think about, well, a lot of cultures believe in reincarnation. I mean, and, I've heard that, reincarnation was even in the Bible before it was taken out. And so you have these cultures that, say that this is true. You have all these cultures that say that spirits exist, that they can communicate with people who are deceased loved ones, for example. And you have all of these, not just anecdotal accounts, of people who say, "Oh, my grandfather showed up in my bedroom last night while I was asleep, and then I, in the morning I saw, there was a phone call from my father telling me that my grandfather died," and so you have all of that. But then on top of that, you have several scientists like Julie Beischel and Gary Schwartz, and then scientists at the Forever Family Foundation, who've all done controlled studies on mediumship, in which they have somebody who's, a sitter that, who wants to have communication with somebody that they've lost, and then the medium, does a reading, and oftentimes from a different room, so that they don't even have a visual of who the sitter is, and then it gets judged for accuracy, and there are many mediums who've been certified. So it's the research, and it's also it's that once you've realized that any of these non-local things are real, it kind of opens up Pandora's box, because you start to say, well, so why would I exclude that as a possibility when I accept precognition, and I accept telepathy, and I accept remote viewing, and I accept, that people can have out of body experiences, and why would you then, and so many, spiritual traditions going back, since the beginning of time practically, say, that there's an afterlife. They just differ in terms of where they think, what they think happens to you, but there's a lot of agreement that there's an afterlife. So why would I just exclude that? And so to me, it's just the rational decision.
I mean, you've shared nothing but absolutely mind-blowing things this whole talk. So this might be an irrelevant question. What would you say is the biggest, most mind-blowing, as we call, given the title of this podcast, what the fuck that you have ever seen or experienced?
Oh, it has to be that patient that I met at Harvard. It has to be that, because it's the first time. It's kind of like the first kiss,
Yes,
her saying to me, oh, you're married to a chemist, and he's applying for a job in 2 different cities right now, and oh, he wants to go to, one of them in his heart of hearts, which was back to Hopkins in Baltimore, but you'll end up at the other one. Oh, what's the other one? San Diego, and I'm just like, you're going to have, one child will be a daughter, you'll eventually leave psychiatry and you'll write books and, just all of this stuff. So that's a hard thing to top, I must say.
Yeah, I really completely, I've had so many just absolutely mind-blowing medium readings, but there is somehow that very first one when I just was only about 10% sure this could possibly work. It's nothing quite like that. So thank you so much, Dr. Powell. It's been such a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate your time. Where can our listeners find you? Tell us. I know there's a little bit of issues getting your book, the ESP Enigma. So tell everyone where they can get your book and where they can continue to follow your research.
Thank you. So they can go to my website, which is Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell, DrDianeHennacyPowell.com. And you'll find there that you can order my book, signed copies of my book. It's out of print, but I still have copies of that left. And unfortunately, the ebook right now is not available, but I'm working on trying to get that back up. But the audiobook is available. There's this newsletter they can sign up for on my website, and then that will help them to be aware of just, how the work is going and any events that I'll be in.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There, you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_ or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?